sitting down. The reason is, I was released from the hospital not too long ago after suffering a heart attack. And I don't know whether I can stand up and talk for 2 hours or not, so I'm going to see if I can sit down and talk for 2 hours. Exaggeration. But I do appreciate your presence today. I'm going to say that I've had 3 loves in my life, 2 wives, not both at the same time now, and the history of Seymour. I have been fascinated with the history of Seymour since a long time ago. In fact, in preparation for this meeting today, I did some reading, and I enjoyed it. And it's probably I'm going to say the 100th, that's an exaggeration. But it was quite a few times that I read it. I think it shows America, the United States, what it stands for, and what happened could probably only happen in this country. And unfortunately, at least in my opinion, it could only happen back when it did. I don't think it could re-happen under any circumstances. It's interesting. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to say, too, that the theme of it is the facts, the fictions, and the legends. Sometimes I will tell you something is the fact. That means if pressed, I can give you some absolute proof of where it comes from. The fictions can liable to come from anywhere. If somebody was really interested, I think I could find proof for that. The legends is things that have grown. When you get through, when I'm through and you get through, you're going to have to figure out for yourself to a certain extent what are facts, what is fiction, and what is legend. And I hope you, after you do that, you carry on and follow the history of Seymour to the maximum. Now there's 2 things I'm extra proud of, too, besides my loves. I'm proud of the fact that somewhere along the line I was named as local historian. Now, I don't know who named me. I didn't challenge it, I accepted it, I took it. But I just want to admit very frankly that I officially am not the local historian. The local historian is for Jackson County and all counties is appointed out of Indianapolis, and there's a procedure that has to be followed. I've never tried to become officially the local historian. I'm satisfied that people in Seymour think I'm a local historian. And number 2, which had nothing to do with the Renos, I'm very proud of the fact that there's been a John M. Lewis practice of law in this county since 1857. Pretty long time. Unfortunately, or fortunately, according to the way you look at it, I'm the last of the Mohicans. I'm John M. Lewis III. The 4th and 5th, which were in existence, were not lawyers and have no plans on being lawyers. Now, to get to what we're talking about, there are 2 questions that I want to raise right at the beginning so that you might be interested in that answered later on during the presentation. And we're not going to follow, I'm not going to follow any written script. If somebody wants to ask a question, don't be embarrassed, but interrupt me, stick up your hand, and I'll at least let you ask your question. I may not answer it according to whether I can or not, but you won't interfere a bit. But there's 2 questions I want to raise principally. One is traced a little bit to the reaction of a lot of good people in Seymour. There's a lot of good people in Seymour that are interested in history of Seymour, but they don't like to talk about the Renos. They think that's something that should be swept under the rug, and then the rug's thrown out, because it shows Seymour in a bad way. Well, it does. But the end of the story makes Seymour a really outstanding place, and that's why I think it deserves repetition. But the two questions getting to it is, what caused Seymour to be recognized as the lawless capital of the Midwest after the Civil War? Now, some people say we shouldn't talk about that, but we will later on. It was. And that same causes, or the same making it that, caused the town of Seymour, Indiana, to be known in capitals of countries throughout the world, because it caused a very diplomatic stir between Indiana, United States, Canada, and Great Britain. And we'll explain that a little bit. It isn't earth-shaking in its historical consequences, but it's something to know. I guess the easiest way to start out with the Renos is kind of give you the background of the family. Now, contrary to some ideas, the Renos were just an ordinary family in Jackson County, Indiana. They changed a little bit during the Civil War and afterwards. We'll go into that. The grandpa, the oldest member of the family, came to Jackson County in 1813 from Tennessee, I think. I do not guarantee that, but there's many people from Kentucky and Tennessee coming here. He settled on a farm which was right on White River, northeast of what Seymour is now. Of course, Seymour wasn't here in 1813. Actually, to some of you that want to know more particularly, it was 2 miles south of Tipton Island. If you don't know where Tipton Island is, that's a story in itself. It's the only battle that ever was fought in the state of Indiana. Awful battle, lasted for 6 or 8 hours. Nobody killed on the Ranger side, and I think two killed on the Indian side, but it was a battle. He had a son, Wilkinson, who was the father of the Renos that we're going to be talking about. Like a lot of people, when he got to be an adult, he went back to Kentucky and picked out a wife and came back to Indiana. Now, I say picked out a wife. I'm not competent to say this, but I have to say it under the circumstances. I think that was a marriage of convenience. That's what a lot of them was in those days. I don't know that love had much to do with the marriage. It may have something to do with the marriage after it was consummated. But anyway, and they came back to Jackson County to live. Frank, the oldest son, was born in 1837. John, the second son, was born in 1838. And there's something that you should note here. I don't know what particular significance it has. Frank was the oldest, but he wasn't the leader. John was the leader, the second son. And that's a little unusual as families go. But as far as history knows, and anything that I've ever read, Frank never complained. He accepted John as the leader, and John served as the leader continuously during the existence of the Renos. Third son was Simeon. He was born in 1843. And then come along Honest Clinton. When I say Honest Clinton, he was named Clinton, but Honest was the name given to him. As far as I can read, and as far as I know, he was recognized that at no time was he involved in the activities of the Renos. That's why he got his name Honest. However, which we'll discuss this later, if you look at this proclamation, down at the bottom of it, they include a list of names of people warned to get out of Jackson County and stay out. There's 2 names. Wilk Reno, never heard of him, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one, but he never was involved as far as I know. And then Clinton Reno was named too. I think, and this is not a fact, this is a fiction, might be a legend for all I know. I think when they wrote this, they included everybody in on the theory it was better to include somebody than leave them out. Then it was, Laura was born in 1851, and she was the only female member of that family. She had nothing to do with it. Now, there's some historians that like to try to put her in the picture. How many of you have seen The Rage at Dawn, the story of the Renos on TV? What's the star? Well, you forget. Randolph Scott, one of my favorite actors, was the star. A beautiful picture, a good Western. But if some of the sites that they have in that picture are concerned in Jackson County, I've never seen them. Of course, the screenwriters had a lot of the activities happening in North Vernon. That's where the lynching and so forth took place. North Vernon wasn't concerned a bit of it. We'll get into a little later. But I'm sure that Laura never married anybody that was investigating it like Randolph Scott did in the movies. I left out Simeon accidentally. Simeon was born in 1843. So we have a total of 5 boys and 1 girl to the original Reno family we're talking about today, or I'm talking about today. People like to say nowadays, being in the law, I experience this frequently, that people go bad because they had a bad youth and was deprived of a lot of things and so forth, whereas if they'd been taken care of properly, they wouldn't have turned out. You can't use that in the Reno family. After the Civil War, Wilkerson Reno was recognized as being the biggest property owner as far as paying taxes was concerned in the county. Now, you have to remember it's paying taxes. He owned enough real estate to fill that category. There were probably other people richer as far as monetary purposes are concerned, but that it was. In other words, the Renos were not deprived. John wrote a book, wrote a story about his life. I think it's on file here in the library. It's interesting reading. I don't believe John wrote it because it's in too good a language. John says in the story that he had to go to school, and the school was on the corner of their land. It was a log cabin, and that having it on the corner of their land was usual in those days. Somebody would say, I'll put a school out here if somebody else will get the teacher and so forth. He said he went to school for 9 years, but he also said that he wasn't too apt for learning. And yet this book is good reading. And he says that the family went to church every Sunday. Doesn't say where they went, but it had to be in the community. And he and his brothers were expected to spend Sunday afternoon reading the literature that they got in Sunday school there. He said that as far as his father was concerned, they was free to do anything long as it wasn't prohibited by the 10 Commandments and the specific order of the Lord. John says in his book that they didn't pay too much attention to it, as you might expect. It's an interesting commentary. Now, you can say, if you want to, the Renos started going bad in the Civil War. Now, I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of times, and you know people that have claimed that World War I, World War II, and some of the others that ruined young men. Frank signed up for 1 year and was discharged, honorably discharged. John signed up for 3 years, but he only spent about 2.5 years in the Army, and he deserted and was carried on the books as a deserter, which wasn't an unusual allegation in the Civil War. Several historians insist that the Reno brothers, John and Frank, participated in the bounty system in the Civil War. They had a very unique system that if you were drafted to appear, or to appear for enlistment, you could hire somebody else to take your place. And it was done frequently. And the way, unfortunately, it worked most of the time, you'd hire me for $500, I'll just say arbitrarily, and that was not an unusual sum. And I would go to the Army and enlist in your name. Of course, there wasn't too much identification at those times, and that was easy done. I took the $500, and 2 weeks later I skipped out, and I could repeat the bounty system half a dozen times. Now, as I say, this is one you'll have to decide for yourself. I have never read any actual facts that the Reno boys, those two brothers, participated in this activity. But it doesn't surprise me a bit that they might have. It is unquestionably true, this is a fact, that after the Civil War was over, John and Frank, with emphasis on John, went around soliciting all the crooks and criminals that he could find to join a gang. And that was the beginning of the Reno gang. And the Reno gang included a lot more people than the Renos themselves. Actually, there is some proof that the gang at times consisted of up from 100 up to 250. Now the secret was, this is another thing Seymour, some people living in Seymour today don't like. It's unquestionably true, John and Frank made a deal with the merchants of Seymour that if they would give them a safe place to stay, they would guarantee that nobody in Seymour would be harmed in any form or fashion by the Reno gang. Plus, the Reno gang gave them insurance and nobody else was going to harm them. And it worked. That's probably the beginning of the protection system that's existed in the United States and some of the big cities for years, but that's it. So, with that in view, what happens to this idea that Seymour became the worst place in the United States for a period? Well, now that didn't stop the other activity. No Seymour business was ever bothered by the Renos or while they were in existence. I don't think any money ever passed hands or anything else, but it was an unwritten rule that if you joined the gang, you didn't do anything in Seymour. But there was an exception to this. Seymour was a very important railroad junction after the end of the Civil War. If you lived in the east and wanted to go south, you come to Seymour and change trains. And if you change trains, unless you're awful lucky, you might have to spend the night in Seymour. And if you was in the south and wanted to go west or anything, but Seymour was a very populous place as far as the railroads were concerned. Now, there was a string of hotels. That's the only way I can describe them. I have not seen any pictures of them. I can imagine that they're not very important institutions or buildings, but there was a string of hotels running from roughly where Ewing Street is now on the north side of the railroad, all the way out to perhaps even to O'Brien. Now those streets were not there, but I'm just giving you that for existence. There was 5 or 6 of them. And the easternmost one was the Raider House. It was probably the greatest den of iniquity in the history of Indiana. There was very strong evidence to the fact that if you came in on the train and you stayed overnight and you went to the bar, because everybody went to the bar, it was more of a social affair than it was drinking, and displayed any money, you ended up the next morning with your throat cut outside. Now the list of murders attributed to Seymour is astronomical depending on what source you read. But there is no question that several, maybe 100 people died under those circumstances in Seymour. And actually William, who was the youngest Reno by legend, got John and Frank to buy him a wagon so he could haul people from the train to the Raider House. That was the headquarters of the gang. So that's what caused the idea that Seymour was the worst place in the world. And it was. I mean, you can argue all you want to, but you can't deny it. Now, say you want to do something about these. Now, in Rage of Dawn, they show a link between the sheriff and the Renos, where the sheriff was involved. Now, that is pure fantasy. When I was judge, and I was judge for 2 terms from 53 to 64, I made it a point at leisure time, and I had some, to go down and read the original records of the Jackson Circuit Court. And there's nothing in the records at all that indicates. Just remember this. The sheriff lived and had his office in Brownstown. The chicanery, the murders, and everything else was happening in Seymour. 10 miles away, 12 if you want to be generous, don't know the exact mileage from the Raider House to the sheriff's office. But there was no communication. You didn't call him up on the phone. You didn't get any radio communication. If they got word to him, like on Monday, he might get to Seymour on Wednesday, the body was gone, the witnesses had disappeared, so he was absolutely powerless. Now, there's some historians that claim that Renos had the authorities in their back pocket. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's true. The Renos had the merchants in their back pocket, but the merchants wasn't interested in what was happening along the Raider House as long as it didn't interfere with their activity. So that's why it got its name. Now we're going to get later into how that was why we was called the lawless capital of the war immediately after the Civil War. Now, when the Reno gang was busted up, and we'll get into that in a very few minutes, that was the end of all this activity in Seymour. And actually, this piece of paper right here, or the original of that document which you have, if you're interested in the lore of Seymour, I urge you to keep it. You ought to read it. It's beautiful language. It's a little stilted. It gets into things that if we printed nowadays, the civil rights and everybody else would be on our back and so forth and so forth. Didn't have any civil rights. They could print what they wanted to. These were printed, displayed in Seymour, and what Renos were not hanged were, and what members of the gang got out. I'll just take a little note, read down there, I think it's the third paragraph in the bottom. If your name was in that list, I don't think you stayed around Seymour to try to argue about it. You left. If you didn't have any sense. But we'll get into that in a few minutes. Now, another fact that is a fact. The Renos, I'm going to go into this briefly, were the first train robbers of a moving train. Now, some historians claim that James boys were. If you've seen the movies and read the history, the Wild West James boys were successors. But the James boys' first train robbery comes 7 years after the Reno train robbery. So they weren't first. You can take it for granted, you take it to the bank and borrow money on it. The Renos were the first one to do it. Now, Frank is given the credit for dreaming up the idea of robbing the train. I can't vouch for that. I don't think anybody else can vouch for that. But there's no question that he was involved. Now, if you read the history, and you go back and read the records, it's a little confusing in places because there was a Frank Reno and a Frank Sparks. And a lot of times, they only referred to Frank, and Frank might be either one or both of them in that specific case. So don't let that fool you. But they were the first train robbers. There isn't any question about that at all. Now, the first train robbery happened. I have to write these down because I can't remember them. I've got them in the books and it's in the other publication. It's October 6, 1866. It's kind of amusing in a minor sort of way. John refers to it as happening in September in his biography. Of course, he was a month off, but I don't know that he was too interested in writing dates down when it happened. Now, 3 of them are allegedly involved: Frank, Simeon, and John. Now, there's some confusion, as I said earlier, whether the Frank mentioned in the news story about the robbing the train, whether it was Frank Reno or Frank Sparks, or whether both of them was there and was mentioned as Frank. Take your choice. There was no question that it was 3 of them there. There was no question that 3 of them were indicted, which will have something to say about that a little later on. Now, why was this train robbery first so interesting, so valuable, and also so unusual? You've got to remember where the United States was again. We had the gold rush in 1849. Shipping the gold, either in coins or as gold, had to be by train. It was the only way it could go from coast to coast. Now, in shipping it, it was in a special safe, what they called a through safe, that was locked, and the man on board the train didn't have any key to that. That was a big deal. But also in the train was a local safe for, I guess you'd say, I don't know whether this is true, I'm just making this up as I go now. If you lived in Lawrenceburg, or where Lawrenceburg was, and you wanted to send your brother $10 in Seymour, you put it on the train to get him there. I don't know about that, but that was what was involved. Well, Frank, if you believe some sources, it's immaterial who conceived the idea. The first train robbery happened, as I told you, on October 6, 1866. And it was just out of Seymour on the east. Some historians put it about where the rear of the state police post is now. Now that sounds awful close, but I'll remind you, Seymour hadn't extended to the east as much as you expect at that time. I don't think anybody can give you the exact location. In those days, you didn't write it up. It's a little bit like I read a story in the old newspapers. That's where I got a lot of my material. The editor said in the weekly, a newspaper in Seymour, we had a lot of fights last week, but I'm not saying anything about it because everybody knows about it. See? That's why they didn't particularly print that stuff. It wasn't important to them where the train got robbed because they knew where the train got robbed. They'd go out there and show you if it was living, see. But that's where it happened. All right. There was $12,000 to $15,000 taken in that one. The other safe was thrown out, but they couldn't open it, and so it wasn't bothered. Actually, a posse come and tried to chase them, of course, it was too late, and so forth and so forth, and they got the other safe back on. Nobody was hurt. Now, there's another interesting comment I want to make. I don't, looking around, I don't know how many here was present at the reenactment of the train robbery in Centennial of Seymour. It was authentic as far as the equipment was concerned, but it wasn't too authentic as far as what happened. If you remember it, the robbers come out of the Ebner Ice Plant, rode about 100 yards down and stopped the train. Now, the Renos never bothered the passengers. They weren't interested in the passengers. Number one, they didn't have enough money. Number two, in those days, every man carried a gun. And you don't go robbing a coach with 100 men on it, or 50 men and 50 women, and every one of those men has got a revolver. That wasn't where the money was. As far as they're concerned, the passengers were home free. Of course, now in the reenactment, we had to have them robbed and stood up and everything else, but that added to it. Now, John and Frank were arrested after being indicted for the first train robbery. Not right away, later on, but they gave bond, and again, that was nothing unusual. I mean, there's another thought that you have to keep in mind. Back in those days, it wasn't really against the law to rob a train, you know what I mean? It was just the idea that there was money going down the tracks, and if you could figure out a way to get it, you had to be arrested, but you didn't have to get hung or anything like that for being arrested for the train. So there was nothing unusual about they gave bond. So remember that now. The second train robbery happened on September the 28th, 1867. It was east of Seymour. The records are very unclear how far east. My personal opinion, it wasn't much farther than the first one, as far as getting the it wasn't much farther than the other one. But the big thing involved there, again, there was money, and there was expected to be about $20,000 to $25,000 taken. Then comes number 3, which is the Main Robbery. Actually, it was the robbery of Marshfield, which is technically in Scott County. Scott County plays an important part of the picture down the road a little piece. But all of them were indicted for this. And Frank and John and the Renos themselves and some of their associates took off for Missouri. Now, there's no question that they were involved in some shenanigans in Missouri. I've never been to Missouri to look it up. Don't know of anything from Missouri sent to Indiana to thinking and having in mind the time. I don't know what it was. But John was indicted and pled guilty to the offense robbery of a county treasurer's office. He was sentenced to 40 years, and in a very unusual proceeding, one that in my 63 years of law I never heard of, the prosecuting attorney said that was too much, and the judge cut it down to 25 years. I don't know that prosecutor, but I haven't met him in the time that I've been a defense lawyer. I can say that very truthfully. But anyway, that took care of him. Now the other boys came back to Jackson County. They were in Jackson County, but they kind of took a low profile. They were still on bond. Now, for the second robbery, there was some indictments laid, and two boys, and I say boys because they were young fellas, got indicted. Their names are immaterial. They're not Renos. They were members of the Reno gang. One of them was said to be only 18 years of age. And they got indicted and were finally arrested. And the 4th of July, the 20th of July of 1968, 3 who had been indicted were traveling in a train from Seymour to Brownstown. When they got to what we call Hangman's Crossing, a red lantern was waved and stopped the train. Now the 3 in the train thought that was their brother criminals trying to help them escape, but it wasn't. It was the first time the vigilantes, 75 to 100 men in masks, took them off the train and hung them on the tree at Hangman's Crossing. Now, I have a lot of fun sometimes in meetings where I talk, ask how many Renos was hung on Hangman's Crossing. And you'd be surprised, I get answers of anything from 2 to 6 or 8. No Renos were hanged there. They're hanged, as you'll find out a little later, but they weren't hanged there. These were rather innocent boys. One of the big things that tickles me the most, again as a lawyer, one of the things that helped to get them indicted, they took snow prints. Now, I don't know how they took snow prints, but the snow prints allegedly were the reason that they were indicted. It must have been something bad because they pled guilty. One got 5 years, one got 6 years. That's the only ones of the gang that I've recorded that actually went to prison, other than John, and he went to prison out of Missouri, not out of Indiana. Now, the second hanging, they had 3 more, and it was on July the 25th of '68, and the same thing happened over again. 3 more were hanged. They were not Renos, but were members of the Reno gang. The last attempted 4th robbery was planned for July the 10th, 1968. It was never went through. The plan was that they made a deal with the engineer that he was going to stop the train about a mile or 2 out of Brownstown. It was eastbound out of Brownstown. They would disconnect it. They were going to run it down the track for a mile or so and do it. The only thing wrong was the engineer also had told Pinkerton, who was the detective agency investigating about this arrangement, and they had the car loaded with men with guns. And there was an awful gun battle, and several of them were killed. Again, there's no recording of why they got killed, because it wasn't too darn important then. Remember, the Reno gang got killed. That was not a time for Hail Columbia, but on the other hand, it wasn't a time for great sorrow. It never made the paper. Now, getting up to the thing that caused the trouble about that caused the United States or caused the state of Indiana to be involved so much. When all this later activities would happen, Frank, William, and Sim went to Canada. John was in Missouri still, and they went to Canada. Well, there was a hullabaloo to have them extradited. And if you remember your history, Canada was a part of Great Britain or England at that time. And I think the Queen was Queen Victoria. And after some detailed negotiations, they made arrangements to permit extradition. Now, Frank, William, and Sim didn't want to be extradited because they knew well that if they got back to Jackson County, they were going to hang at Hangman's Crossing. So they fought it. How they fought it, I don't know, and it's immaterial. But they lost. Well, they were brought back to Indiana by train and boat both, and they were put in the New Albany jail. They were put in the New Albany jail because, number one, it was supposed to be the best jail as far as escape proof in Indiana. It was made of 5 bricks. I get a kick out of it. The house that I live in now, it's over 100 years old, and it's got 5 bricks too. I don't know that we ever were in jail, but I guess we would rank up with the New Albany jail. Of course, they had one advantage in the New Albany jail. The cells themselves was lined with a half-inch of steel. Now, I don't think there's any steel in my house. Now, on the night in question, there was a car, railroad car, left on the siding right outside the station in Seymour. This was a southbound train, north and southbound train, and we're not talking about the east-west train. The car, supposedly, if you remember where the Hamer's coal yard was, just barely north of the intersection of the railroad, was where the car was. In the middle, all the shades were drawn. In the middle of the night, 50 to 75 masked men, masked persons, I don't think there was any women involved, but it wasn't labeled that way, got on the train, or got on this car. The train was picked up, the southbound train picked the car up, took it to Jeffersonville. It was disconnected in Jeffersonville. When in Jeffersonville, the people on the car commandeered another engine and train to haul them to New Albany. And when they went to the New Albany, they stormed the jail and hung the 3 Renos. Now actually, the sheriff put up a little resistance and got shot in the arm, but he wasn't quite a tar fool. He didn't try to fight too hard against 50 to 75 people. And they hung them, and from every account that's possible, they were rather vigorous in trying to stay alive. Frank was particularly bad. It took several to hold him. William took it rather lackadaisical, and Sim. Frank was first, William was second, Sim was third. That was the only 3 of the Renos that was actually hung. And as I say, they were hung in Floyd County. After the hanging, they got back on the train. No, they got back on the car, went on to New Albany to Jeffersonville by forced labor, so to speak. Got to Jeffersonville, the train picked them up and brought them back to Seymour. Now the big secret of this was the Queen of England, well, she didn't do it personally, but she got very upset about the fact that these people, even though they were criminals, had been hung under promise that they would be protected. The governor of the state of Indiana had a very unique explanation. He said that his guarantee only lasted while they was in state control, and when they got into control of the sheriff, he was not responsible. It took a while to smooth that over. It was a period of time that Britain and the United States were close to breaking relations. And as I say, that's the time the historians say Seymour was castigated as a town in ever capital in Europe, but there wasn't any to speak of in our continent. But it finally, they smoothed it out, and it was going. But that was where it happened. So just remember, there's only 3 Renos hung at that time and at that place. Now going on ahead, after all this happened, the vigilant, well, let's go back just a minute. The Secret Service allegedly got in this investigation of the train, of this car, and supposedly no records were ever found or ever made as to who hired the train, who hired the car, who paid the bill, or anything else. It is a secret, and it's been a secret. Now, since then, there's been a story, more or less legend, that a man named Jones was the one that handled it, and I don't know, I won't go into that for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's getting a little later than I expected, and number 2, it isn't based on fact. As far as the book is concerned, nobody has ever explained who paid the bill and so forth. Now, you can say the railroad did it for nothing. I doubt that, for the reason that the railroad was the one that was pushing for the elimination of the gangs. But this piece of paper right here was the thing that broke the camel's back, so to speak. If you notice, it is dated December the 21st, 1868. It was published and hung, I guess, on every pole tree in Seymour. In a short period of time, you had 3 Renos hung. You had John still in custody in Missouri, and the rest of the gang had disappeared. Now, I say the fact that Seymour had the guts, if you want to use that expression, with some reluctance to take the matter in their own hands and get rid of the Reno gang is an extreme plus in their favor, favor of Seymour, because it shows when the chips were down, they knew what to do. That's why I think the Reno story is very interesting for the matter of history in Seymour. Now, it's interesting. John came back to Seymour. Eventually, he was released. He was under bond for the first train robbery. And this was a long time after the train robbery. And it was finally dismissed because there was no witnesses available to bear against him. Of course, there wasn't any snow prints that got the other boys in trouble. I can tell them that. They didn't have those. So he actually was released without any problems. I think he had some problems. He was allegedly run a tavern in Seymour for a while, which had a gaming attached. I think one thing that's kind of astounding, he was arrested and convicted in federal court for passing counterfeit money, you got a year or so. But the interesting part of it is that he died in his own house, living in Seymour. Just a minute. I've got the date here. If I can find it. He died at the age of 56 on January the 1st, 1895. And he was living at the northeast corner of Indianapolis Avenue and 5th Street. So if you want to go up and look, there's no stone up there or anything else, but you can say that's where John died, but he died in bed. Now, generally speaking, that is the story of the Renos. There's more to it than I have said, but let's go back to one of the first questions. What caused Seymour to become the lawless capital? There's no question it happened. Now, several historians have treated this subject in different ways. They've used every reason known to mankind. Ed Boley, in his history of Seymour, gives the best. He explains this matter of the railroad interchange, and that was the reason why it does, and that's the one I favor. Again, a lot of things about the Renos you can't put your finger on and say this actually happened or this caused this. It's interesting to note, and again I'm going back, out of the 6 members of the Reno family, we have Frank, John, and Simeon who were hanged. No, Frank, Simeon, and William who were hanged. Well, that's still wrong. But I'm trying to say Frank, Simeon, and William were hanged. John died in his bed. Clinton and Laura drifted into history without being too much involved. Interesting sidelight again, the elder Renos, the parents, filed for divorce, which was very unusual in those days. They actually separated, but were never divorced. Simeon, Laura and Clinton lived with her, and she lived on the old place. Frank, John, and Simeon lived with their father in the new place on Indianapolis Avenue. Ladies and gentlemen, I've talked for about 50 minutes, and that's a long time. I'll try to answer any questions. I've cut it a little short on purpose because I don't want to keep you all afternoon on Sunday afternoon. I'm sure there's a baseball game that's more interesting than what I've said. Yes?
Which Renos are buried in the old city cemetery?
That's a good question. Glad you asked. Technically speaking, you can take it for what it's worth. I won't guarantee this, but technically speaking, 4 of them are buried there. That's John and the 3 that were hung. They're not buried where the monuments are, though. The story about that is, when they were first, well, go back to 1816, and in those days, you didn't get very much of a monument as far as being buried. But there were monuments for them. But the mayor at that time, for so many people bothering it, that he ordered the tombstones taken up, and they were put in a culvert, and they stayed there for 15 or 20 years. And somebody located them and said that's who it was, but they didn't know where the graves were, so they just put the tombstones up, and it's more of a memorial, but they are buried in the cemetery, but your guess as to where they're buried is as good as anybody else's. That's the way I'd answer. Anything else?
Well, didn't they, when the vigilantes went down to New Albany, didn't they get on the train the night before and went to Vienna and then to Lexington to get them out of jail there and didn't find them? And
No, now that's a story I can't vouch for.
well, it's in
That's a separate activity. I will not say it is wrong. I know about it, but as far as the record of the train was, Remind you, it was a southbound train.
Yeah.
It went down overnight and didn't make those stops.
It was in
That
the book,
doesn't say that-
the masquerader was in that book. read
I
that
say,
book.
that doesn't say that that didn't happen. I don't mean it that way. But I can't vouch for it.
Yeah.
Somebody else back there had a hand up. Okay.
What was the date of the hanging of you?
I got it
You
here.
said it, I didn't hear.
No. 68. Let me get through here in a minute. Take me a minute, but I'll find it. Because that is a very good day to remember. Very easy to get a lot of papers. Oh, I got one thing else I want to say when I find this for this little. December 12th at 4:30 a.m. They were lynched. Now the date, I'm sorry.
I have
Sure,
something here that says,
1868.
I have something here that says December 12th. Did it say 60?
What year?
68?
After the
68.
That's what I thought, 68.
December
I'm
12th.
not sure that's
It
it.
says here they left on the night of the 11th,
Yes,
mysteriously from Seymour,
yes, that's it.
and then
That's the
the
one.
12th, 1868.
I want to add two other things. One of them is kind of funny, but it's good. Shortly after this bulletin, or call it whatever you want, was put out, a piece appeared in the Louisville Democrat, which was a predecessor to the Courier Journal by several years, to the general effect that Seymour is now an honest town. It was printed. The story is that a man came up from Jeffersonville, or Louisville, I think it was Louisville, and he accidentally dropped a $5 bill when he got off the train in Seymour. That evening, when he went back to get on the night train, the $5 bill was still there. The theme of the story was that nobody in Seymour is going to commit a crime for fear of the vigilante. Now, the second thing that I want to mention, that hasn't gotten to, but it's one that I intended to speak about. The Renos, in their escapades, got a little over $100,000. 96 plus 25 plus 15 or 20. I haven't had any recently, but there's people that think that that money is buried around Seymour. I had a lady 10 years ago, I'll say arbitrarily, don't hold me to the time, came down from Muncie. She had a map that she bought that showed where it was, and it was out around, somewhere around Reddington, take your pick. You couldn't tell too well from the map. And she wanted me to endorse it, and I refused to endorse it because I said I don't have any idea. They're still interested. I can take you to people that I will not name publicly that insist they know where the money was and where it is. It's still in Seymour, allegedly. That might be a legend, might be a fiction, I don't know. It doesn't matter. Now, there is no question a major businessman of Seymour was treasurer for them, in that he held their money, and when they had to give a bond or something, they could get it off of him, $500, $1,000, whatever it was. He was, some of his friends told him he's going to get killed. He said, they can't kill me, because if they kill me, they won't know where the money is. The best story, without getting more specific, and I'm not going to get more specific, allegedly, if you dig in the proper place in the basement of a building downtown, right in the middle of Seymour, you might come up with $100,000 I don't suggest you go out and rent two to start, because number one, you couldn't get in the building, and number two, the other part of the story is realize this was gold coins and gold bills, and if it was recovered, the gold coins would be worth extremely more, probably double the same price. So it'd be worth it. But that lady came down from Muncie was the best I ever had. Now, more questions. Go ahead, ma'am.
Do you still have the articles that you wrote for the Seymour paper?
I have one set.
Several years ago, I read one of them about how cold it was, I think in 1812 or a little later. And then there was another article to pass that up, but I wasn't able to get it.
Well, some of the, well, that's not necessarily concerned with the Renos, but in answer to your question, they are 10 volumes of look back. Some of them are out of print. I have a full set. You're not going to get mine, I'll tell you. When I go on, whenever that is, my family can do with it what they want. There's 8 of the pictorials. Some of them are out of print. When the Tribune and myself discontinued arrangements, there was no animosity in it. They didn't think the look-backs were important, the new management. They let me have all the unsold copies. The Tribune sold them, and I gave them away, but that's beside the point. But I'm the only one that I know of that has got a full set.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yep.
I got 3 questions right in a row. Number one, you talked numbers. You talked the Reno gang was roughly, the highest number you came out was 250, 100 or 250. Yeah. You said all the merchants were essentially complacent about the Reno gang, or neutral, or wouldn't do anything, wouldn't lift anything. You talked about the vigilante group being in the neighborhood of 75 was your lowest figure to 150, which was your largest figure.
Yeah.
What was the population of Seymour to supply all these people?
Well, now, number one, it wasn't restricted to Seymour. If you established vigilantes, I'd say it covered Jackson County and Jennings County and anybody else who wanted to get in on the front. Now, but that's what it is. Of course, these figures are not in stone. The only one that I know of that is legitimately computed is the 50 to 75 that got on the car that went down to New Orleans. Now, I can show you stories, but I have to go home and get to my library, where as many as 1,000 people stopped the train. There wasn't 1,000 people stopped the train. I mean, there wasn't 1,000. But the reason I give the elastic figures is because I can't tell you the amount.
But what was roughly the population in
I've
this
got it
area
at
then?
home, I can give you what the census said, but I don't know. Roughly speaking, it was probably less than 1,000, I bet on it.
Less than 1,000 people live in this area?
You could,
Then the merchants had to be involved in that vigilante group.
pardon me?
The merchants had to be involved with that vigilante group.
Well, yes, but vigilantes are a little bit like the Ku Klux Klan. You didn't go around advertising your membership. Yet when the whistle blew, you got there. Now, there's no question as to what the vigilantes did. But there's a lot of questions as how many is involved. Now, to give you another example of the merchant situation, going back to the time of the railroad coming in, the railroad was scheduled, the East-West Railroad was scheduled to go through Rockford. And Rockford merchants were suggested that they pay an incentive. They didn't do it, and he did, but that's a story of another. But in other words, shortly after that, take it easy, I can give you the dates, but I don't have them with me. Shortly after that, the town of Rockford was burned to the ground. That was when it was on the other side of the river, incidentally. And the new Rockford was put on this side, but it burned to the ground. The Renos, in many publications, were given credit, yet there is no evidence that I've ever seen that they burned it down. But on the other hand, if you are a merchant in Seymour, and you get, and a man comes up to you, and I'm getting a little bit like the movies when he says, you know, like you do in the movies back in some of the time, they want him to pay protection. If he comes up and says, I'm a member of the Reno gang and we need so much from you, with the idea of Rockford being burned down, he would contribute. Now, he's not going to advertise in the paper about it. He might even not tell his brother or his family about it, but it was there. I will not vouch for the numbers. I could tell you what the census was. I've got the census. Yes,
Are there any Reno descendants in this area?
if there are, they're hiding. I've never heard of one. I can tell you who one of the people who signed the bond for him, but I won't do it because that family is still in town. Surprise you.
My third
You can
question.
go to Brownstown and find out if you know where to look. Yes.
My third question. After these incidents occurred, was law and order established, legal law and order established in the Seymour area? You said there was a sheriff in Brownstown. Was there a deputy or any type of a marshal?
No, they didn't
Someone-
have deputies in those days. I mean, they wouldn't have had a deputy.
There was no law and order established in
No, it
Seymour?
was local law and order. Now, you had a policeman. Now, when the police department was established, I can't tell you offhand again, I have that down. Another story on that. If you know, one of the mayors and one of the policemen got in a shoot-'em-out in the streets of Seymour. Nobody got shot, a lot of shots were fired, but nobody got shot, but they actually did it. But,
When was it? Excuse me, I'm sorry.
pardon,
I'm
When
sorry.
was it?
When did this occur?
the shooting,
Yes.
I'd have to look it up, I can't
Okay.
do it. I've got an index at home and I've got several books, but I can't tell you offhand, I can't keep, that's why I write some of these days down when I do this. Way back there, somebody had a hand up, I see it in the dark.
Yeah. I can't say all, but I know I've contacted you before. My name's Dean Wiesner. I've got most of your lookbacks stored on computer, where they can be recovered, reprinted, researched, whatever. Those, and I've got a number of other documents and things like that, postcards, stuff like that, that I've done over the years. And most of that's been contributed here to the library. What they've done with it, I don't know, but I think they're going to get that on file here, so those can be pulled up, retrieved,
That's the
whatever.
purpose of this meeting, and that's the reason that I'm here, honestly. My biggest goal, ever since I was old enough to know anything about it, number one, was the history of Seymour not be lost. It bothers me that there isn't a time, for example, in high school, where they study the history of Seymour. Now, the story of Beatty W. Shields, if that isn't America personified, I don't know what it is. Here's a man that comes in here walking from Tennessee. No education. And he is the first entrepreneur. He couldn't spell the word, he couldn't pronounce it, and he wouldn't know what it meant, but he was the first one it meant. But he had the guts to get the railroad to come through Seymour. And he got it because he offered them the land, he offered to build the field west, which is still the same field there, but the prize was he offered to start a town and name it after the engineer in charge. And I don't know any man that would turn down a chance to have a town named that. But now that ought to be in the education. The library is presently engaged. They've got a lot of stuff from mine. I've given them everything I can spare. They've accumulated. They're going to have a local history section. Now, when it's going to be up, I don't know whether the head of this deal is back here in the back yet or not. She's probably hiding in the dark. Huh?
I'm over here.
Answer that question.
We're working on it.
Well, that's what I mean. What's your goal is what I'm trying to say.
Well, our goal is to preserve what we can and to make it available in addition to preserving it.
For example, they've gone through some of my stuff and made an index, and that's quite a job, I can tell you. But I give them credit, but I still think that history shouldn't be forgotten. Next. Yep.
As far as Wilkerson, the father, was concerned, some things that I've read say that he would have had to, he never was implicated, but he would have had to have some kind of part in it or no one. And about buying, after the town was burned, they bought up the property at Rockford. What are your feelings about that?
Well, you're not going to, at least I've never run into anything that I would say was historically the basis for it. I have read what you said, and that is true. I have never been able to say to you that the Renos burnt down Rockford. I mean that. Now, it's easy enough to say they did it, but I would remind you with the construction and the buildings at that time, a fire could start, and with the lack of fire protection, which they probably never had, the whole town, which wasn't too big, could have burned up through no fault of any particular individual.
I understood it was a series of fires, not one big fire.
Well, the big fire is the one that finished it, so to speak, yes. Of course, I've had a rule all the time, and you've been the look back. I won't say something is a fact unless I can got something to back it up. And I have never done that. I don't intend to start now. Nobody asked me to do it here. I don't mean that. But that makes it a little limited. It's interesting to me that Rockford was a town, and if you want to be a little broad-minded, the railroad coming to Seymour is a little bit like Freeman Field coming to Seymour. Both of them come under rather strange circumstances. How many in this room know that of the two officers that selected Seymour, one was from, as a Freeman Field headquarters, one of them was from Seymour. But one from Seymour made a pretty good job. Tell you another, you heard the story that Bologna missed being a chosen as captain by one vote. That was true. There was 3 commissioners appointed to select a site that eventually became Indianapolis. 2 of them picked Indianapolis, the other one picked Rome. So they lost by 1 vote. But 1 out of 3, not 1 out of 10,000. Okay, I'm ready to quit, ready to go. Go.
Have you ever heard of a brother in the Reno gang named Trick, T-R-I-C-K?
That is maybe this one that's named here. I never heard of him. I never heard of him until I read this. This is Wilk, W-I-L-K.
Well, I have a newspaper from that date that says that Trick was involved with them.
I don't question it. I will only tell you, and take this with a grain of salt, I wouldn't accept every newspaper account because they had those days editors had a lot more freedom. They wrote what they wanted to sometimes, not all the time. It's hard to say. I can't sit here 90% of the time. I can say when the train went to New Albany, for example. Might have to look it up, but I can tell you that. But I can't tell you how many was on the damn car. You say 175, which I've seen some. Now they were sitting on each other's laps. But there's no question there was enough of them that they went down there. Of course, there again. All they had to overpower was the sheriff. He put up a perfunctory. I think they could have killed him by shooting, but they shot him in the arm so he could have some excuse. Hey, incidentally, I forgot this. The cell that they were hanged in is in Seymour. I don't exactly know where. It was out at Freeman Field at one time. Oh, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a bunch of us got together. Somebody had it. They were tearing the jail down, and they offered the cell, and we bought it, including transporting it up here. But again, nothing's happened to us.
Yeah. Still there.
I don't know where it is now.
Still there.
Still there.
I got $20 invested in it.
Where is it?
I don't know. You
Where
know?
there?
Out on the northwest side by the ultralight hangar.
It was sitting out at Freeman Field in the open.
It was there a year ago, I stood in it.
Huh?
It was there a year ago, I stood in it.
Okay, I won't say it wasn't. I don't know where it is. Okay.
I just want to say thank you on behalf of the library for doing this. We appreciate it very much.
One of those that are interested, be sure you take one of these, not because my picture's in it. Take one of them. This is